In the icy waters of Norway, hidden among the mountains, lay a monster. Its length was nearly that of 3 football fields. Its 8 15-inch guns could level a small city with a single salvo. Its armor was so thick that even the most powerful torpedoes of the era couldn't scratch it. Its name was Tirpitz, and it was the most dangerous German battleship of World War II. If this is your first time hearing this story, consider yourself lucky, because what I'm about to tell you is one of the most stubborn, determined, and epic hunting stories in the history of warfare. A 3-year struggle by a group of British pilots to achieve the impossible. Stay with me throughout this video, because this story will keep you on the edge of your seat. But first, I have to say this. Every week on this channel, I tell the lesser-known heroic stories of World War II. If history excites you, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, and please hit that like button. Now, if you're ready, let's begin our story. In early 1942, the British Navy was living a nightmare. Tirpitz was Nazi Germany's largest battleship, and unlike her sister ship Bismarck, the Germans didn't want to risk her this time. After Bismarck was sunk in the Atlantic in 1941, Hitler decided to use Tirpitz much more carefully. The ship was hidden deep within the Norwegian fjords, but just sitting there was enough to turn Allied strategy upside down. Think about it for a moment. In the North Sea, lurking in a dark fjord, a massive war machine lies in ambush. No one knows when it will emerge, no one knows where it will strike, but the moment it does, it could tear Atlantic convoys to pieces. It could cut off vital supply convoys heading to the Soviet Union. It could block the sea routes that were Britain's lifeline. This is why the British called Tirpitz the Lonely Queen, a force that could paralyze its enemy simply by existing without doing anything, all alone. The Royal Navy was forced to keep a large fleet stationed in the North Sea because of this ship's existence. Battleships, aircraft carriers, destroyers, all of them waiting there just in case Tirpitz emerged one day. These resources could have been used on other fronts, the Mediterranean, the Pacific, but no, Tirpitz had them chained. Winston Churchill was so troubled by this situation that he declared the destruction of Tirpitz one of the war's top priorities. But saying it was much easier than doing it. The ship was anchored in one of Norway's most protected fjords. Torpedo nets surrounded it. Dozens of anti-aircraft batteries were positioned along the shores. Steep mountains formed a natural shield on both sides of the fjord. German fighter planes patrolled constantly. Approaching Tirpitz meant running toward death. The British attempted their first attack in March 1942. Albacore torpedo bombers took off from HMS Victorious. The target was Tirpitz. The pilots attacked bravely, but the result was disappointing. The torpedoes the aircraft carried got caught in the nets surrounding the ship. A few reached the target, but Tirpitz's thick armor was strong enough to handle these blows. The attack failed. Many pilots never returned. The British didn't give up. In September 1942, a much bolder, much crazier plan went into action. Operation Source. This time, they would use midget submarines instead of torpedo bombers. These tiny submarines, called X-craft, would travel hundreds of miles with only 4 crew members and slip beneath Tirpitz. They would place their mines under the ship's hull. In September 1943, 6 X-craft submarines set out. The journey was hellish. 2 submarines were lost before reaching the Norwegian coast. Another had to turn back due to mechanical failure. The remaining 3 submarines slipped into the fjord with incredible courage. They passed under the torpedo nets, they evaded patrol boats, and finally they reached the massive hull of Tirpitz. The mines were placed, The timers were set, but while retreating, the submarines were detected. The crews were captured, yet the mines exploded. Tirpitz shook violently. The damage appeared significant. Allied intelligence estimated the ship would be unable to move for several months. But there was a problem. Tirpitz hadn't sunk. It was still there. It was still a threat. The Germans began working day and night to repair the ship. Hundreds of workers, engineers, and technicians were sent to Norway. In the fjord, in the shadow of the mountains, Tirpitz was being brought back to life. For the British, this was unacceptable. Even the possibility of Tirpitz setting sail again threatened the entire Atlantic strategy. Convoys bound for the Soviets were being prepared in early 1944. If Tirpitz became operational, it would mean disaster for these convoys. The ship had to be destroyed immediately. And at this very moment, a legendary unit stepped onto the stage of history. 617 Squadron, the Dam Busters. You may have heard this unit's name before. In May 1943, this special squadron, under the command of Guy Gibson, had struck at the heart of Germany. They had destroyed the massive dams in the Ruhr Valley with specially designed bouncing bombs. This operation went down in history as one of the war's bravest and most innovative air raids. Most of the pilots never returned, but they succeeded. The dams were destroyed. Germany's industrial heart was flooded. Now, this legendary unit faced a new and perhaps even more challenging mission: to sink Tirpitz. If this story excites you, please like and subscribe. Thank you. But here's a question. Why 617 Squadron? Why not another unit? The answer is simple. These pilots were trained for missions that seemed impossible. They were masters of low-altitude flight. They were unrivaled in precision targeting. And most importantly, they were the only unit capable of using next-generation weapons. Ordinary bombs wouldn't be enough to sink Tirpitz. The ship's armor was too thick. Torpedoes didn't work. The nets stopped them. Mines caused damage but couldn't sink the ship. Something new was needed, an entirely new weapon. And that weapon would be born from the brilliant mind of Barnes Wallis. Barnes Wallis. You might recognize this name too, the engineer who invented the bouncing bomb, the genius who made the dam raids possible. Now he was working on a new project. It was called Tallboy. 12,000 pounds in weight, more than 5 tons. This was no ordinary bomb. It was an earthquake bomb. Wallis's concept was this. The bomb didn't have to hit the target directly. It would bury itself underground, then explode and create the effect of a massive earthquake. Underground shelters, concrete bunkers, heavily armored ships, none of them could withstand this shaking. Tallboy had a special aerodynamic design. It spun on its axis as it fell, giving it incredible stability and accuracy. When dropped from high altitude, it approached the speed of sound. When it hit the ground, it buried itself dozens of meters deep. Then it exploded, and the explosion displaced everything around it. 617 Squadron was selected as the unit to use this new weapon. The pilots were trained. Tallboy bombs began production. The target was set: Tirpitz. But the operation wouldn't be easy. Tirpitz was anchored at Fjord in northern Norway. It was out of range for bomber aircraft taking off from England. Lancaster bombers couldn't fly that far with a full load and return. A solution had to be found. And that solution came from the Soviet Union. The British asked Stalin for permission to use a base, Yagodnik, a Soviet airbase near Archangel. The plan was this. The Lancasters would take off from Scotland, fly over Norway, bomb Tirpitz, and then land at the Soviet base. There they would refuel and return to England. Stalin gave permission. Operation Paravane was beginning. September 15, 1944. In the early morning hours, engines began roaring at Lossiemouth Base in Scotland. 27 Lancaster bombers were taking off into the darkness. Hanging in each of their bellies was a 5-ton Tallboy bomb. Target, Tirpitz. The pilots' faces were tense. They had over 1,000 miles ahead of them. Norway's mountainous terrain, German radars, anti-aircraft batteries, fighter planes, all of them were waiting. And there was no turning back. They would either hit Tirpitz or they would try to reach Soviet territory. 617 Squadron was once again taking off on a historic mission. Just like the dam raids, they were attacking a target that seemed impossible. But this time, the target wasn't a concrete wall. It was a 45,000-ton steel monster. The aircraft headed north. When the Norwegian coast came into view, the pilots marveled at the scenery. Snow-covered mountains, deep fjords, icy waters. But beneath this beauty, death was hiding. A German fighter could appear at any moment. Anti-aircraft fire could begin at any second. As Fjord approached, the pilots' heartbeats quickened. The entrance to the fjord was visible, and there, among the mountains, lay a massive shadow, Tirpitz. But there was a problem. The ship was covered in fog and smoke clouds. The Germans had been warned of the attack in advance. Special smoke machines had been activated. A thick blanket covered Tirpitz. The pilots could barely make out the target. Still, they dropped their bombs. The Tallboys fell with a howl. Explosions shook the fjord. Columns of water rose to the sky. But because of the smoke, it was impossible to see the results. The Lancasters headed for the Soviet base. The pilots waited tensely. Did they hit Tirpitz? Did the ship sink? The answer came a few days later. Reconnaissance aircraft flew over Fjord. Photographs were taken. And the result? Tirpitz was still afloat. But this time it had taken serious damage. A Tallboy had struck the ship's bow. A large hole had opened in the forward section. It was taking on water. More importantly, the ship's main engines were damaged. Tirpitz could no longer move under its own power. The Germans decided to move the ship out of Fjord, but they couldn't take it for repairs. The engines didn't work. Instead, they towed the ship south, near Tromsø. There, in shallow waters, they planned to use it as a stationary battery. This decision would bring about Tirpitz's end, but 617 Squadron didn't know this yet. All they knew was that the monster was still alive, and it needed to be killed. We've reached the end of Part 1. If you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. We're continuing. In Part 2, you'll see the continuation of 617 Squadron's relentless battle against Tirpitz. More attacks, more danger, and finally, that unforgettable finale. Don't miss it.
Welcome back to Part 2. We're continuing without slowing down. Tirpitz was wounded, but it wasn't dead. After the September 1944 attack, British intelligence was working around the clock. Reconnaissance aircraft were constantly flying over Norway, taking photographs, preparing reports, and the news that came was both hopeful and concerning. It was hopeful because Tirpitz could no longer move. The damage from the Tallboy bomb had devastated the ship's engine room. The massive propellers weren't turning. The 45,000-ton monster couldn't advance even a meter under its own power. But it was concerning because the Germans hadn't given up. Tirpitz had been towed out of Fjord and pulled south. Its new anchorage was the coast of Hakøya Island near Tromsø. There, in shallow waters, the ship would be positioned as a stationary floating battery. Its 8 15-inch guns still worked. The threat to Allied naval forces continued. Moreover, the new location made things even harder for the British. No, actually, it was the opposite. The new location presented an unexpected opportunity. Tromsø was much farther south than Fjord. What did this mean? The range had now become reachable for Lancaster bombers. Without needing to land at Soviet bases, they could take off from Scotland, strike Tromsø, and return. Of course, with some modifications. 617 Squadron Commander Wing Commander Willie Tate assessed the situation. Tate was an experienced pilot who had taken command of the unit after Guy Gibson. He hadn't participated in the dam raids, but he had successfully led the squadron in subsequent operations. He was a cool-headed, determined, and extremely skilled leader. Tate faced a math problem. The distance from Lossiemouth to Tromsø was approximately 1,100 miles. Round trip made it 2,200 miles. The Lancaster's normal range couldn't handle this distance, especially while carrying a 5-ton Tallboy in its belly. The solution was radical modifications. The aircraft's front gun turrets were removed, armor plates were taken out, every unnecessary piece of equipment was discarded. Extra fuel tanks were installed inside the fuselage. The aircraft were made as light as possible and fuel capacity was maximized. These changes came at a cost. Without the front turrets, the aircraft were defenseless against attacks from ahead. Without armor, the crew became more exposed to anti-aircraft fire. But there was no other choice. These risks had to be taken to hit Tirpitz. It was the last days of October 1944. 617 Squadron and 9 Squadron would operate together. A total of 40 Lancasters were preparing to deliver the deadly blow to Tirpitz. October 29, 1944. Operation Obviate began. Engines were started in the darkness of morning. The heavily loaded Lancasters struggled to accelerate on the runway and took off one by one. While crossing over the North Sea, the pilots maintained radio silence. Tension increased as the Norwegian coast approached. As they neared Tromsø, the sight the pilots saw was demoralizing. Clouds everywhere. A thick, low cloud cover had blanketed the fjord. Tirpitz wasn't visible. The pilots descended. They tried to get below the clouds, but the fjord's narrow structure and the surrounding mountains wouldn't allow it. Dropping bombs at low altitude was both dangerous and ineffective. Tallboys needed to be released from high altitude to function properly. Wing Commander Tate made a difficult decision. A few aircraft dropped their bombs, but most turned back. The bombs didn't hit. Tirpitz had escaped once again. The weather had protected it. When the Lancasters returned to Scotland, the pilots' morale had collapsed. Thousands of liters of fuel, dozens of flight hours, incredible risks, all of it had been for nothing. Tirpitz was still there, still posing a threat.
But 617 Squadron wasn't a unit that would give up. These pilots knew what failure meant. In the dam raids, 34 of 53 airmen never returned. The losses were painful, but the mission was above everything. Tirpitz had to be destroyed. November arrived. Weather conditions in Norway were always unpredictable. Meteorologists were constantly preparing reports. The crews were standing by. They were watching for the right moment. And that moment came on November 12, 1944. Early in the morning, the meteorology report arrived. Clear weather was expected over Tromsø. Cloud cover would be minimal. Visibility was perfect. This was an opportunity that couldn't be missed. Operation Catechism was beginning. Activity started at Lossiemouth Base. 31 Lancasters prepared to take off, 18 from 617 Squadron, 13 from 9 Squadron. Hanging in each of their bellies was the deadly payload, 5-ton Tallboy bombs, a death warrant for Tirpitz. At 3:00, the first engines started. In the darkness, one by one, the heavily loaded aircraft took off. A long and dangerous journey lay ahead, but this time the pilots were determined. This time they would succeed.
As they flew over the North Sea, the sun began to rise. The Norwegian coast appeared. Snow-covered mountains, frozen lakes, endless forests. The scenery was breathtaking, but the pilots' eyes were on the target. The Lancasters were flying low. They were weaving through the mountains to evade German radar. Pilots and navigators advanced without losing concentration. The slightest mistake could mean crashing into a mountain. Tromsø was approaching. The pilots' heartbeats quickened. The mouth of the fjord came into view, and there, on the shore of Hakøya Island, Tirpitz was waiting. This time, there was no smoke. This time, there were no clouds. The massive ship was gleaming in the morning sun. Its gray hull, its giant turrets, its long guns, everything was clearly visible. A perfect target. But the Germans weren't idle either. Dozens of anti-aircraft batteries surrounded the ship, including Tirpitz's own weapons. Over 100 guns were waiting for the British aircraft, and the alarm had already been sounded. When the first Lancasters entered the fjord, hell broke loose. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. The sky filled with black smoke and shrapnel. Pilots were maneuvering to avoid the fire, but they weren't deviating from their course. The target was Tirpitz, and they would reach it. Wing Commander Tate made the first dive. His Lancaster aligned directly over Tirpitz. The bombardier took aim, and the Tallboy was released. If you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. The 5-ton bomb fell with a howl. It gained speed, spinning on its axis. Within seconds, it approached the speed of sound, and it struck Tirpitz's deck. The explosion was horrific. A massive fireball rose up. Smoke and debris erupted into the sky, but more was coming. The other Lancasters were also dropping their bombs. Tallboys rained down like a storm. One struck the middle of the ship, another hit the stern, yet another exploded underwater, right beside the hull. The earthquake effect shook the ship. Inside Tirpitz, chaos reigned. Sailors were running in panic. Fires had broken out. Water was pouring in. The ship began listing dangerously to one side. And then the unexpected happened. Tirpitz's magazine detonated. Sea Turret, one of the ship's main gun turrets, blew into the air with a terrifying explosion. The turret, a steel mass weighing tons, was hurled 100 meters away. The explosion was so violent that structures on the shore shook. The ship was now capsizing. The 45,000-ton hull rolled onto its side. Its keel became visible. Water foamed as it swallowed the hull. Sailors were jumping into the sea. Many couldn't be rescued. The Lancaster pilots watched this scene from above. The monster they had hunted for years was finally dying. Tirpitz was taking its last breath in Norway's cold waters. Within minutes, it was all over. Tirpitz lay completely capsized. Its massive keel protruded from the water. The ship hadn't sunk because the waters were shallow, but it was destroyed. It would never pose a threat again. 617 Squadron returned without losses. All 31 aircraft reached Scotland. The pilots were welcomed as heroes. Winston Churchill personally sent a congratulatory message. The shadow that had threatened Britain for years had finally lifted. The sinking of Tirpitz wasn't just a military victory, it was a psychological victory. The giant battleship that the Germans thought was invincible had been destroyed by a handful of brave pilots, and without losing a single British aircraft. The operation's success depended on many factors: Barnes Wallis's brilliant Tallboy design, the pilot's incredible skill and courage, perfect planning and coordination, and perhaps most importantly, a determination that never gave up. 617 Squadron had conducted 3 separate operations to sink Tirpitz. In the first, they had to use Soviet bases. In the second, weather got in the way. In the third, they succeeded. This showed the true face of war. Victory didn't come easy. It required patience, perseverance, and sacrifice. The wreck of Tirpitz still lies near Tromsø today. After the war, the Norwegians dismantled part of the ship and sold it as scrap, but a large portion is still there, beneath the cold waters, standing as a silent witness to history. There were nearly 1,900 sailors on the ship that day. About 1,000 were rescued, but around 900 lost their lives. That was the bitter reality of war. Every victory meant people on the other side who lost their families. For the 617 Squadron pilots, the Tirpitz operation was just one chapter of a long and bloody war. Many continued to fly until the war's end. Some never made it home, but all of them are remembered as part of one of history's most elite air units. Wing Commander Willie Tate flew 101 operational sorties throughout the war. This was a record in bomber command. Even after sinking Tirpitz, he remained on duty. He continued flying until the final days of the war. Barnes Wallis continued his work after the war as well. Following the Tallboy, he designed an even bigger bomb, Grand Slam, 10 tons in weight. These bombs were used to destroy underground factories in Germany and bridges thought to be impossible to demolish. The Tirpitz operations were the pioneers of the modern precision bombing concept. The smart bombs used today, laser-guided munitions, all of these have their roots in these innovative World War II operations. Barnes Wallis's ideas changed aviation history. But the most important legacy was the power of the human spirit. The pilots of 617 Squadron took on missions that seemed impossible. They destroyed dams, sank giant battleships, demolished underground bunkers. While doing so, they suffered extraordinary losses, but they never stepped back. This spirit still lives in the DNA of the Royal Air Force today. 617 Squadron is still active. They no longer fly Lancasters, but F-35 Lightning fighter jets. But the unit's motto hasn't changed. Après moi, le déluge. After me, the flood. Don't forget to subscribe and like for this wonderful story of heroism. Now we continue with the final part.
We've arrived at the final part. We're continuing without slowing down. November 12, 1944, 0941. Tirpitz was no more. The 45,000-ton steel giant lay capsized in Norway's icy waters. Its massive keel protruded from the water, looking like a rusty whale skeleton. Smoke was still rising. Fuel oil had formed a black layer on the sea surface, and hundreds of sailors were trying to survive in the freezing waters. Above, 31 Lancaster bombers had set course for home. The pilots' faces showed a mixture of exhaustion and relief. They had finally hit the target they had been chasing for months, even years. The lonely Queen was dead. The nightmare of the North Sea had ended. Wing Commander Willie Tate looked back from his cockpit. He saw the column of smoke rising over the fjord one last time. Then he turned his head and continued flying toward Scotland. The mission was complete. But this story wasn't just about sinking a ship. This story was proof of what human will, engineering genius, and collective courage could achieve. And in this final part, I'll tell you the true meaning of this epic, the legacy it left behind, and why it still matters today. First, let's look at what happened immediately after Tirpitz sank. When the news reached London, the War Cabinet was in session. When Winston Churchill read the report, a wide smile spread across his face. He had been waiting for this moment for years. Tirpitz had been a thorn in Britain's side. They had been forced to keep the Royal Navy's best ships in the North Sea. Resources had been wasted. Strategic flexibility had been restricted. Now this nightmare was over.
Churchill sent a personal congratulatory message to 617 Squadron. In it he wrote, "I congratulate all the crew on this magnificent achievement. The destruction of Tirpitz has opened an important page in the history of naval warfare." But there was something Churchill didn't know, or perhaps he knew but didn't say openly. The sinking of Tirpitz wasn't just a military victory, it was the beginning of a new era of warfare. The future of strategic bombing, precision targeting, and special forces concepts was being shaped by this operation. Barnes Wallis's Tallboy bomb was revolutionary in the history of warfare. No weapon before had been able to destroy such a heavily armored target in this way. The earthquake bomb concept completely changed the traditional understanding of bombing. Direct hits were no longer necessary. A Tallboy exploding nearby could destroy the target with underground shock waves. For the rest of the war, Tallboy and its bigger brother, Grand Slam, were used against Germany's most protected targets: underground factories, U-boat pens, railway bridges, and viaducts. Most of these were targets impossible to destroy with conventional bombs, but they couldn't resist Barnes Wallis's weapons. 617 Squadron continued to undertake these special missions until the end of the war. The Bielefeld Viaduct, the U-boat pens in Bremen, the Arnsberg Viaduct, and many more. In every operation, they used the experience gained from the dam raids and Tirpitz operations. Every time, they achieved the impossible. Now let's step back and look at the big picture. Why was Tirpitz so important? Just because it was a big ship? No, Tirpitz's importance came from the strategic threat it represented. In World War II, sea routes were vitally important. Britain was an island nation. It imported everything by sea, from food to fuel, from weapons to raw materials. Aid from America was carried by Atlantic convoys. Lend-lease materials going to the Soviet Union were delivered to Muransk via the North Sea. Tirpitz had the potential to cut these vital routes. In a single sortie, it could sink dozens of merchant ships. Its sister ship, Bismarck, had sunk the battle cruiser Hood in seconds in 1941. Tirpitz was even more powerful, and it was a matter of time before it emerged from the Norwegian fjords to attack convoy routes. That's why the Royal Navy had to allocate enormous resources to stop Tirpitz. The home fleet's largest ships were constantly on standby at Scapa Flow. Carriers, battleships, cruisers. Thousands of sailors were positioned against the threat of a single ship. The sinking of Tirpitz meant these resources were freed up. Ships could be shifted to other fronts. They could be used against the Japanese in the Pacific. They could participate in operations in the Mediterranean. Strategic flexibility had been regained. But perhaps most important was the psychological effect. Tirpitz was the last great symbol of German naval power. Bismarck had sunk. Scharnhorst had sunk. Gneisenau had been rendered unusable. Only Tirpitz remained, and now it too was gone. For German sailors, this was a heavy blow. The Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, had now completely lost the capacity to conduct major surface operations. Only the U-boats remained, and they were suffering heavy losses against Allied anti-submarine technologies. The sinking of Tirpitz was a sign that the war was nearing its end. 6 months later, in May 1945, Germany would surrender unconditionally. But on that November day, in Norway's cold waters, the beginning of the end was taking place. Now I want to tell you the stories of some of this operation's heroes, because great events don't happen without individual courage and sacrifice. Wing Commander James Bryan Tate, known as Willie Tate, he was 617 Squadron's commander during the Tirpitz operations. Tate flew a total of 101 operational sorties throughout the war. This figure was a record in Bomber Command history. Most pilots were rested after 30 or 40 sorties. Tate exceeded 100. Tate was the pilot who dropped the first bomb on Tirpitz. In that historic attack on November 12th, he led his squadron to the target. He flew through the area where anti-aircraft fire was most intense. He didn't hesitate for a moment. He showed the target to his bombardier, and the Tallboy was released. After the war, Tate received the Distinguished Service Order 4 times. He also received the Distinguished Flying Cross. He became one of Britain's most decorated pilots, but he never liked talking about heroic stories. He always remained modest in interviews. "We just did our duty," he would say. Another hero was Barnes Wallis. Yes, he wasn't a pilot, he was an engineer, but without his genius, neither the dam raids nor the Tirpitz operations would have been possible. Wallis was over 50 years old when the war started. Most people think about retirement at that age. Wallis was designing weapons that would win the war. The bouncing bomb, Tallboy, Grand Slam, all of these were products of his mind. Wallis's working method was unique. He mathematically modeled every problem. He conducted tests in wind tunnels. He built prototypes with his own hands. He fought bureaucracy, because there was always resistance to new ideas, but Wallis never gave up. For the Tirpitz operation, Wallis developed special versions of the Tallboy bomb. He adjusted the fuse systems. He optimized the bomb's fall angle. He calculated every detail. The pilot's job was difficult, but he had given them a perfect weapon. After the war, Wallis continued to make his mark on aviation history. He worked on supersonic aircraft designs. He developed the variable geometry wing concept. This technology was later used in aircraft like the Tornado and F-14. Wallis passed away in 1979 at 92 years old. He left behind a revolutionary legacy. What about the nameless heroes? Pilots, navigators, bombardiers, radio operators, flight engineers. Every Lancaster had a 7-man crew. Hundreds of young men served in the Tirpitz operations. Most were in their early 20s. Some never made it home. Where did these young men come from? From every corner of Britain. From London's working-class neighborhoods, from Yorkshire's farms, from Scotland's fishing towns. There were also volunteers from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. All of them had come together for the same purpose, to fight for freedom. Bomber Command was one of the most dangerous postings of World War II. 55,000 airmen lost their lives. This figure was one of the highest casualty rates among all British armed forces. Every night, young men went up into the sky, and many never came back. 617 Squadron knew these losses intimately. In the dam raids, 34 of 53 airmen were killed, over 60% casualties, a devastating rate for any military unit. But the survivors regrouped, retrained, and continued fighting. Casualties in the Tirpitz operations were much lower. In the first attack in September, several aircraft couldn't land in Soviet territory and the crews were captured. But in the final attack in November, not a single aircraft was lost. This was proof of how well the operation had been planned. Now I want to tell you what happened after Tirpitz sank, because the story didn't end when the ship capsized. There were still surviving sailors inside Tirpitz. When the ship rolled over, hundreds of men were trapped inside the hull. In darkness, in cold water, with their oxygen running out, they waited for help. Norwegian fishermen and German rescue teams immediately sprang into action. Holes were cut into the hull. Trapped sailors were pulled out one by one. The rescue operation lasted for hours. Approximately 87 people were brought out alive from inside the hull, but many more couldn't be saved. The total death toll was approximately 950. Young German sailors lost their lives in Norway's cold waters. That
was the bitter reality of war. Every victory meant grieving families on the other side. Every sunken ship was the death of someone's son, brother, or father. Today, Tirpitz's sinking site is a popular spot for diving tourism. Most of the hull was dismantled as scrap after the war, but some parts still lie beneath the sea. Divers can see rusted steel plates, severed cables, and the remains of a war machine buried in silence. There's a small museum in Tromsø. It tells the story of Tirpitz. Scale models of the ship, belongings from the crew, photographs and documents are displayed. Thousands of visitors come every year to see this dark but important page of history. 617 Squadron continued to exist after the war. The unit remained one of the Royal Air Force's most prestigious squadrons. During the Cold War, it took on nuclear deterrence duties. It flew strategic patrol missions with Vulcan bombers. During the Falklands War in 1982, 617 Squadron Vulcans carried out one of history's longest bombing missions. Flying thousands of miles from Britain to the South Atlantic, they struck Argentine targets. The spirit of the dam raids and Tirpitz operations was still alive. Today, 617 Squadron is equipped with F-35B Lightning II fighter jets. It's one of Britain's most modern and capable air units. The pilots proudly carry the legacy of their predecessors from 80 years ago. The unit's emblem is still the same, a dam struck by lightning, the symbol of the dam busters. The unit's motto hasn't changed either. Après moi le déluge, a French expression. In English, after me, the flood. This motto symbolizes the unit's destructive power and determination, a force that destroyed dams, sank battleships, and changed history. So what can we learn from this story? Why does it still matter 80 years later? First, we see the power of determination. 617 Squadron organized 3 separate operations to sink Tirpitz. In the first, they were partially successful. In the second, weather got in the way. In the third, they succeeded. They didn't give up. They didn't quit. They learned from each failure and tried again. Second, we see the importance of innovation. Conventional weapons weren't affecting Tirpitz. Barnes Wallis invented something new. The earthquake bomb concept changed warfare technology. Today's precision-guided munitions are descendants of the Tallboy and Grand Slam bombs. Third, we see the value of teamwork. Sinking Tirpitz wasn't one person's achievement. Pilots, engineers, intelligence officers, meteorologists, ground crews, everyone did their job perfectly. The result was a collective victory. And fourth, we see the price paid for freedom. Most of the heroes in this story were in their 20s, in the prime of their lives, far from their families. They came face to face with death. Some never made it home. Those who returned had to live with their traumas. Freedom wasn't free. It never was. Thank you for watching this video. If this story moved you, please subscribe, like, and share your comments. Your support keeps this channel going. And now I want to tell you about the next video. The story of 617 Squadron didn't end with Tirpitz. In the final months of the war, this unit attacked even more impossible targets with much bigger bombs. Grand Slam, 10 tons in weight, history's largest conventional bomb. And the target was Germany's supposedly invincible U-boat pens. Their concrete walls were 10 meters thick. No bomb could damage them until Grand Slam came along. In the next video, I'll tell you about 617 Squadron's final great mission. Don't miss it. History isn't just events left in the past. History is a mirror that helps us understand today. And the story of 617 Squadron is one of the brightest reflections we see in that mirror. Courage,
determination, innovation, and sacrifice. These aren't just wartime virtues. These are values that represent the best of humanity in every age, everywhere. 80 years after Tirpitz sank, the Norwegian fjords are still silent. The cold waters are still dark. But the steel skeleton lying in those waters reminds us of something. That resisting tyranny is possible. That targets that seem impossible can be hit. And that freedom is worth fighting for. The dam busters completed their mission. Now it's our turn. To keep their legacy alive, to tell their stories, and to never forget. Because forgotten heroes truly die, but those who are remembered live forever. After me, the flood. See you in the next videos. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye.